This is Mrs. Palmer-Quay with a very brief video on elements and compounds to get us set up and ready to talk about classifying compounds and naming compounds in the next video. So to review from the previous video, substances can include both elements and compounds. Elements are composed of only one specific type of atom. So every one of these blocks down here on the periodic table, whether it be helium over here or calcium over here, those are an element. Whereas compounds are composed of more than one type of atom. So if we combined, we wouldn't combine helium, but say we combined calcium and oxygen over here, so we combine our calcium and oxygen, we would be making a compound because we're combining more than one type of atom. Compounds can be separated back into their individual elements, but only by chemical means. We cannot separate out the calcium from the oxygen in calcium oxide by physical means. We can't put a knife there and divide the two up there. We'd have to do a chemical reaction. Remember that elements and compounds have properties. The last video talked about physical properties, characteristics that we can see, and we don't change the substance in order to observe them. Things like density, melting point, boiling point, the color of something, is it soluble in water? Those are all physical properties. Chemical properties, in contrast, are the ability of a substance to undergo a particular chemical change. How do they react? What happens if they react with another substance? Typically, chemical properties see an element being able to form a gas in a reaction or a precipitate, that's a solid that leaves a solution and falls down onto the bottom of your beaker. Or they release energy, like you saw in some of our lab experiences, or perhaps even change color, which we also did see. The properties of the elements that make up the compound are not the same properties of the compound for the most part. So for example, table salt is sodium and chloride. NaCl is its formula. Sodium reacts quite violently with water. In fact, it reacts so violently in the heat that it gives off, it ends up igniting hydrogen gas. It pulls hydrogen off the H2O molecule and then ignites it. Chlorine is extremely toxic. It will react with water to pull the hydrogen to make hydrochloric acid. So these extremely dangerous chemicals go together to make table salt, which we put on our food every day. And we don't worry about the table salt falling apart in our body to make sodium and to make chlorine. And thank goodness. So the properties of elements as individual elements can be very different than the properties of the compound that these elements can form. There are two laws that your book mentions, and we will do more with the realities that come out of these laws as we get into balancing equations and doing things with chemical formulas. But just to go over them, the law of definite proportion states that a certain compound always has the same ratio of elements. So sodium chloride, NaCl, is always one sodium and one chloride. It would be something different if it was a different ratio. Water is always H2O. Then we have the law of multiple proportions that says that the ratio will always be whole numbers, so that we're not going to see fractions. We don't have half of an element in something. It's always one whole element or two whole elements or three whole elements or more. The last point I want to make about compounds is that compounds require bonds between the elements, whereas mixtures do not. So if we pretend that this red dot here is some oxygen and the blue circles are hydrogen, then if we put oxygen gas and hydrogen gas together, we can create a very nice mixture of gases, but we won't necessarily make water. You need to have bonds form between the oxygen and the hydrogen, connections made between the two atoms before you actually get this compound. So remember that when we're talking about a compound, that means that we have bonds forming between the elements. They aren't just together in the same container. So this finishes what I wanted to cover in this short video, getting us ready to talk about classifying and naming compounds in the next one.